This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Undistracted podcast. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the show where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. One of the things a lot of us rely on for direction and support in that pursuit is our church community. But what happens when your church gets sick? What happens when the community is unsettled? There's no shortage of documentaries and stories about Hillsong right now. Ever since New York City campus pastor Carl Lentz admitted to extramarital affairs, countless accusations have been made about work conditions volunteers experience, abuse, founding pastor Brian Houston's alcohol consumption, his appearance in court, and how donated funds should be used. There's certainly a much bigger conversation to be had about that, what exists behind the headlines and the nuances of what we've seen publicised. We cannot cover all of that in a single podcast episode, but one angle I wanted to highlight comes from the new SBS documentary, The Kingdom. Hosted by Walkley award-winning journalist and TV host Marc Fennell, who you might have seen on Mastermind or heard on Stuff the British Stole, The Kingdom looks at the impact of Hillsong's changing status on the Pentecostal movement more broadly. Who inherits the church members who've left, and what should they do differently? How does someone like Marc, who's been in and outside of the church, interpret the tipping point the Hillsong scandals have triggered? The Kingdom premieres on June 8 on SBS On Demand. It'll air 7:30pm Sunday, the 11th of June on SBS, and Marc joined us ahead of the release. Let's welcome Marc to the show.
Oh, the pleasure's entirely mine. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And in making this documentary, it's really the first time you've publicly spoken about some of your upbringing around church, around Pentecostal Christianity as well. What was the role that Christianity played for you growing up?
Well, I was sort of born into it. So we grew up Mum came over from Singapore, Dad was born here. And so we sort of grew up in Pentecostal churches right around Sydney, which is where I was raised. And I think what often gets lost is the fact that there's like thousands of Pentecostal churches. A lot of them aren't the big mega churches, as you well know. So we kind of grew up in a lot of the small ones, the ones that meet in sort of RSL clubs and, school halls. But it kind of began with the big one, the church that would eventually become Hillsong, but at the time was called CLC, Christian Life Centre. And so it was something I was sort of born into. And I think one of the things that the film kind of charts in amongst sort of a big picture of how did the Pentecostal world get to the point that it's at now and where does it go next? Part of the thread in there is actually charting me, which, by the way, I will say was not the original plan. The original plan did not involve me sitting in front of a camera just like blurting out my life story. That happened later. And I think it was an interesting process for me because I did leave. Like I left the church when I was relatively young, sort of 19, 20-ish. And I sort of quiet quit and never really, as you mentioned, I've sort of sporadically mentioned it here and there, but I've never really gone, okay, I should address this. And I realized I had a lot of unaddressed feelings about it. And so it's in part a wide angle view of Pentecostal Christianity, but also me going, I was sort of born into this thing, didn't have a lot of choices in the early days, and gradually I had to kind of find my own way through what I believed and where I sit within that world. And I think that journey forms a part of the film as well.
Yeah, it's part of the reason why you had to bring in your personal experience, because it was just a story that was so close to home. Of course, as a journalist, as someone telling this, you have to kind of show your hand a little bit.
That's exactly it, right? That is exactly it. I think you have to... I don't like being a story. I think you can tell watching it. I'm like, oh, he looks uncomfortable. I don't like being a story. But I think at a certain, when you're doing something that you do have a personal experience of, I do think you need to be upfront with the audience where you're coming from. And that's really where it started. It was like, look, this is my background. This is where I'm at. And I think that is part of the job of being fair, right? Because once you're upfront with the audience about what your experiences are and what your kind of attitudes are, you're kind of inviting the audience to judge your fairness, right? You're inviting the audience to go, all right, well, I can see where he's coming from, and you can tell he's trying to do this for this group and that for that group. And I think it's actually, if you were to pretend like it wasn't a part of your life, you'd actually be doing a disservice to everybody, disservice to the people that you're talking to, who you're asking to share, and of course a disservice to the audience, who eventually will find out if they care enough, and then they'll feel cheated. So I'm like, look, I'm just going to be upfront about where I'm coming from, and then please judge the fairness of this inquiry accordingly. I don't think it's always necessary for journalists to be sort of upfront about their background. I think it's not a bad thing to do. I often say, I think because I come from the world of kind of narrative podcasts, narrative documentaries, I always think it's important to kind of tell an audience early on, like, why am I trusting this person as my guide to this world, right? It's not just about like, hello, I'm Marc Fennell and I'm on a journey, which I'm guilty of doing and other things.
Yeah.
But I think it's actually about saying to the audience, look, this is where I'm coming from. This is why I think you should follow me into this, because there's no shortage of documentaries about Pentecostal Christianity, and particularly Hillsong, particularly at the moment. I think it's important to say, look, this is why it matters to me, and I hope you understand why I'm invested in it.
It's good that you explain that, because one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you specifically, when there are so many other documentaries about this, there are so many about Hillsong right now, is that the approach you take, I think, includes not only your personal experience, not just conversations with people who've had really legitimate, horribly traumatic experiences, but you also talk about why something like what's happening at Hillsong right now is going to impact the Pentecostal experience around Australia. Like, the identity of church in Australia right now is being rethought in so many ways. And I think you do take a genuinely balanced approach to starting that conversation. Why does it intrigue you, though, that particular angle, that particular question, how, Hillsong's quote unquote demise is going to impact Pentecostal Christianity more broadly?
I'm not sure Hillsong's necessarily facing a demise. I do think it's in crisis and will be for some time. I shouldn't laugh as I say that, because that's people's real lives and real spiritual journeys, and I don't mean to make light of it, but I do think what they're experiencing right now is significant, right? And it's also a mistake, I think, sometimes that journalists and the media make, which is talking about the church as a monolith, and actually that's not how it operates. We're talking about lots of individual people's journeys sitting within communities, some of which are vastly different. They're still Pentecostal, but they're vastly different to what Hillsong looks like. And I think one of the reasons why I kind of came at it the way that I did, which is I'm in this weird position, right, where I was born into this world. I've experienced the big churches, the small churches, but I've also left, right? I'm not in there, but I still have family who's inside Pentecostal churches of different sizes, right? And I remember when I was growing up, and you would start to see the negative stories about Hillsong kind of in the sort of, late 90s, early 2000s. And I think what always struck me is that the thing you saw on TV, whilst legitimate, like there were real concerns about, money and coercive behavior. I think those things are really important to talk about. But the world that you saw on those news reports, and it's true now, bore little resemblance to the thing that people rocked up to on Sunday or, cell groups or connect groups. And I was like, that world that is being portrayed on television feels quite different to the thing that I experience. And similarly, I think on the other end, you'd go into kind of groups and you'd be part of youth groups, and there'd be conversations about things in this world that were not great, that could use work. I'm being very diplomatic there. But there is this sort of and I don't want to speak about the entire church, because again, it's not a monolith, but there is a sort of a thick vein of toxic positivity, which prevents, I think, real change on issues that do need to be addressed. So what you have here is an internal world that has the potential to be quite stymied. And again, some churches have dealt with these issues in really effective, public, transparent ways. And I think it's important to acknowledge, but there is still an issue. I think it's safe to say there has been issues. So internally, there's thing stymieing progression, and externally, everything just looks like an attack, right? And it's like, okay, well, I'm in an unusual position where I'm probably one of the handful of people, of a degree of profile in Australia where I feel like I can kind of interpret both worlds. So that was my kind of starting point. I was like, how do I do something? To be absolutely honest with you, like, it's more important for me that Christians watch The Kingdom than anyone else, because it's their lives that are affected by these issues. Like, people can watch from outside, and whenever you see stories about church, it's like you can kind of tell that they're like, sitting underneath it is this like little thing of like, look at them. a freeze. And I just don't whilst I think you can have a reasonable exploration about what's gone badly and why people are attracted to it without necessarily attacking people's faith. And I say that as a non-believer. Do you know what I mean? I think you can do that. And that was something I felt was missing. I felt like that examination of what happens to everyday Christians told from somebody from the outside, but who cares enough to respect people. I don't know.
Yeah.
I say it out loud and it doesn't sound like that big an achievement, but it's all you need to do is look around and go, there's actually not a lot of that coming from the secular world, right? I know there's really great journalism that happens inside the Christian world, but there's not a lot that comes from the secular world. I was like, okay, well, hold on. Why? And why not? And can we fix it?
And it's probably how people wrestle with the dilemma. I know this for a lot of people of a Christian perspective and also otherwise. How do you deal with the dilemma of the fact that alongside the brokenness, you also have, as the kingdom points out in some ways, you've got these people who have found genuine, life-changing community. They have found something that has given them purpose and an anchor and all of this sort of stuff. When you see that tension, those two things coexisting, what's your response to that kind of great dilemma?
Well, I guess I was that tension, right? So I, towards the end of high school, my parents' marriage sort of disintegrated, and I just sort of subsumed myself and I sort of got myself pseudo adopted into a bunch of church families, the youth group I was going to at the time, and I make no bones about this. They saved my life. They represented, I don't know if they knew what they were doing, but they represented the best of what this faith could be. At the same time, I had all these lingering questions that were going unanswered about faith, about God, and things like that. So these things can coexist. And I actually think it's interesting that we frame it as a tension, because I'm actually not sure that it is one. I think what it is both of these things can be true at the same time. And they can be true because it's not a monolithic faith. It's not a person sitting on high. Well, okay, this is where I get myself into trouble. They're in terms of humans, there's not somebody sort of architecting the whole thing, right? So I think you have to acknowledge that, like it or not, the church is still made up of people, right? And we bring our emotional complexity into those worlds. And in the case of me, we take it outside of those worlds as well. And I think so long as humans are part of the equation, there's going to be a range of experiences, right? And I think the job of somebody like me is to go, I cannot, in a 90-minute film, I cannot convey all of the experiences, but what you're looking for is, key experiences that illuminate the whole, right? And I think to do that effectively, you have to show why people have been drawn into this world. We're talking about I guess a denomination that at one point was the fastest growing Christian denomination in this country. Not only that, I mean, like it or not, whether people like Hillsong or not, it is one of Australia's greatest exports. We're talking, millions of people, not just in Hillsong churches, sing Hillsong songs every week around the world. They sent churches all around the world.
Yeah.
As far as Australian exports go, it should go like Iron Ore, Hemsworth Brothers, Hillsong, right? In terms of effectiveness. So I think we have to acknowledge that it was, and to some extent still is, something that attracted lots of people. So you have to kind of, beyond just saying, oh, they've got good music and nice lights, there's something else there. Right. And I think that's the other thing, that when, stories about Hillsong are done, that it always kind of comes back to the same ideas of, bright lights and music and, the same power chords. And it's not, and I think that misses the trick, because that's part of it, no doubt. But there's something else there that keeps people, and you have to examine that. And I think it was like, well, you can't, if you are telling the story of the kingdom, you can't, I think it's important to talk about people that have had a bad experience, yes, but you also have to kind of understand, why was it something that grew so effectively for so long, and what did that take? Who did that serve? Those are real questions worth asking, but I think you have to kind of go, if you're going to call something the kingdom, you have to take the wide-angle view of it.
Yeah, and so as you really looked at church life, in the Hillsong context and beyond, and in your own personal journey, decided to say, no, this is not for me. What were some of the things you were seeing that made you want to take a step back? It's
interesting. I feel like this film would have been a lot easier narratively to construct if I had had some defined, horrific experience, as so many people do. I don't wish that on anyone, obviously, but I think one of the reasons why it was tricky to make is So I'm the only person. So we have a small team that make documentaries in this unit that I work in, and I'm the only person that has any background in church at all. And they've all known me for about 10 years, right? So they've all known me for a really long time. And I think it kind of was a surprise to them when that it sort of bubbled up. Oh, wait, you were raised? Really? Yeah. And I think what I encountered that was enough for us to go, I think this is a good space for us to explore. So we started looking, Elise, the director, started looking into different interviews, and we started shooting interviews. And what actually happened was I started having very weird reactions. I would get to the end of interviews and be like in this slight fugue state of like, "Ooh, it feels like I'm being transported back to childhood." And I realized pretty quickly that I hadn't explained to anybody what my relationship was. And then they were like, "Okay, we need to sit you down in front of 3 cameras," and everyone just fired questions at me. But so, what was your childhood like, and where did you go, and and that was probably the first time in 17 years that I actually sat down and addressed why. Like I had mentioned it in other interviews in passing, but that was probably the first time I actually interrogated why, because it was surprisingly easy to quiet quit. It was surprisingly easy to just not rock up. And that actually is something to be said about the bigness, the Pentecostal world. It's quite easy unless you're sort of ingratiated with sort of smaller groups, or like a youth group, I think at the time would have been more relevant. It's actually quite easy to just recede, walk out the door, and for no one to notice. And actually, to the point that the first church I did visit after 17 years actually was not in Australia. It was actually one of the churches in the US that we didn't get on camera. And I'm kind of glad we didn't get on camera, because I walked in there and and this is going to sound awful, but I had like this immediate fight or flight reaction, because I hadn't been in one for so long. I sat in the back row. I looked where the exits were. Like I think that was the moment I was like, I've not dealt with this.
Yeah, there's some things to process here.
Yeah, and I think to get back to the core of your question, I think for me, the questions started stacking up. Like you start with your sort of classics of like, what do bad things happen? And then eventually you kind of graduate to, a whole bunch of issues. Does God really feel that way about queer people? And does, like, where do we stand on the no sex before marriage thing? Is there wiggle room there? Did we actually create the world in 7 days? Are we going with an allegory on that? And those questions just started stacking up. But the biggest question out of all of that was, for me, quite simply, why can't I feel you? Why, like I was raised in a world where you'd have people speaking in tongues, and, we had like, intercessory spiritual warfare in my living room as a kid. I'm the only kid who went to school who regularly had demons being kicked out of his living room on the reg. And some people may agree with this or disagree with it, but Pentecostalism is a faith built on feeling. Like the music, the lights, that is about getting you to a feeling. And if you don't feel it, if you, and particularly if you're looking around and everyone else is having these important spiritual moments and you're not, it's very hard. I faked it for a long time. And I think I reached a point where it's like, I don't understand why I'm doing this anymore. And that was really, it was on one hand hard, and then also a release, because to no longer feel like I had to fake it anymore was kind of a relief. But again, I think it's a me thing rather than a make judgment on other people's belief thing, if that makes sense. Like it was clearly not working for me. But I can't deny what was happening to people around me. Like, I don't think they were faking. So I think that's where the complexity comes in. I'm not denying other people's experience, but I did reach a point where I was like, I actually can't fake this anymore.
And when I heard you talking a little bit about that in the kingdom, part of my thinking was, I wonder, because as a whole, overall in this 90 minutes, a lot of the conversation is about the experience of church, the services, the machine, the quote-unquote business of church. There's not really much conversation about Jesus or the central teachings of Christianity. This isn't a documentary that analyzes those fundamentals necessarily, but what is happening within the structure of church and how that is potentially affecting people's lives. Do you think that is maybe one of the underlying flaws in this whole thing, is that sometimes the actual experience of church is getting in the way of what we talk about around Jesus, around the actual core foundational beliefs of Christianity?
Yeah, there's there's a line that one of the contributors in the film who's an ex-Hillsong-er, I'm assuming that's the term we're going with for them.
Sure.
She says something at the end where it's actually, she has a very bad experience. She's left, She says something that's always stuck with me. And as soon as she said it in the interview, it kind of stuck in my brain, which is it's actually strengthened her faith. Because now when she looks around at church environments, she does something very simple. She measures the behavior she's witnessing in church structures, in everyday behavior. She measures it against Christ. And it makes it really easy for her to make decisions about what she thinks as community she does and doesn't want to be part of, because she just measures it against Christ. And I think it's a really important idea that she says, because I'm not equipped to say it, right? I don't have the experience to measure something against. But I think it's important to kind of recognize that, particularly as people have variable experiences within Pentecostal churches, that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to that. Some people absolutely find their home and belonging in these environments. And, you can see people in the film that have that experience. Some people get out and never want to walk away and never deal with it again. And just their lives are better. And then there's a lot of people in there who are kind of picking through the rubble and going, what is the core of what I actually believe? What is the core of this that is true to me? And I think those are the most interesting, to me at least, those are the most interesting stories, because it's a sort of watching people rebuild their faith has always been intriguing to me. So I think that aspect, you're right, it's not a big focus on, firstly, I'm kind of at pains to point out to people that it is an interrogation of a model rather than an attack on faith, right? And I think the model is worthy of examination because it is so often replicated. And sort of one of the opening, I guess, ideas of the film is that it's no one likes to admit it, but a whole bunch of Pentecostal churches, some of which have lived in Hillsong's shadow for many years, they're setting up shop pretty much in Hillsong's backyard. No one likes to admit it. And it's really funny seeing how people's faces kind of seize up when you put that idea to them. They're like, no, definitely not. No one likes to be accused of sheep stealing, but I actually think what it is that those churches have all privately, well, not all of them, but many of them have kind of privately admitted that they're inheriting. They're inheriting, people from Hillsong who've been hurt, who are looking, or at the very minimum, are looking for something different, right? And I think that tells you that there is an inflection point. We are living through an inflection point right now where something has shifted. And I think that's why it's important to look at, because in this moment, with new churches essentially having the potential to kind of, move into that space, there's an opportunity for change. There's an opportunity to address some of these things, volunteerism, honor culture, how we talk about giving, how we talk about offering. There's an opportunity to examine that and go, do we want to do it exactly the same way? Do we want to maybe rethink how we do this? And that's not a thing I can answer because I'm not in the world. But I would hope that, people watching, particularly people in the church, and it isn't necessarily about people specifically within the Pentecostal church. What I would like is for Christians to look at it and go, and then look at their own community and go, how much of that's applicable to my community? Because some of it won't be, and that's okay. And in fact, that's kind of great, right? But I think what I hope is that people look at it and whenever you make a film like this, what you're actually doing, and this is true of this film and Stuff the British Style and a whole bunch of other things that I make, I'm not starting a conversation, but I'm injecting ideas into a conversation that I can't finish. It ends with what people take into their church communities, into their cell groups and connect groups and Bibles. That's where it ends or where it develops. And I guess I kind of hand it back to the faith and see what the faith does with it.
Yeah,
What I mean?
Yeah, it's like two thoughts come to mind. The first is that I feel like just as you felt like, you had to hold this experience back because, as I've heard you say previously, you don't want people to sort of tar you with that brand of you've had this experience and you can't necessarily share with it. Like on the one hand, I think you're going to be prompting people to go, hey, this has been my experience. I held it back, but now I feel comfortable talking about it. But then I also think too, in so many ways, it may be uncomfortable for you to think about it this way, but, when you don't feel God, I think it's also intriguing for people like yourself that actually, in a way, prompt necessary conversations. I think that there would almost be a sense that it's like you're, in a way, operating as a kind of I don't want to say like the voice of God, but it's like I feel like you're doing
I feel
something.
like that ends badly for me.
That ends badly for all of us when we say that. But I just go, like, I feel like God could almost be, in a way, like using your abilities and the capacities you have to actually prompt conversations that he's like, yes, please ask these questions. Please do this kind of work.
That's the exact point I want my mum to hear, because I know she's listening to this. Big Hope 1032 fan, and that's the point I want her to hear, that her backslidden son might be being a vessel for God. That's the part I need her to hear. No, I think that's very. First, I think it's very kind and generous of you to frame it in those terms. I'm not sure. I would hope. Look, my intention whenever I make a film or a TV series or a documentary is a basic principle of, as much as possible, do no harm. But, the fact of the matter is, the mere act of talking about things that have been hurtful, it can't help but bring rise to uncomfortable feelings. And I think what is notable about this film is nobody is more uncomfortable on screen than I am. So I'm not doing anything, we're not doing anything to anyone else that I haven't been subjected to myself. But look, I guess my hope is that it's a tool for change. Like I said, I'm not, I would not be party to an attack on people's faith. I don't, whether this faith or any other, but to be clear, my attitude to any faith is, if you have something that helps you move through the world, helps you make sense of the world, and you're not doing harm to others, crucial point there, then I'll back you. Right? And that's true of any faith. The do no harm to other things, I think, is possibly where some people of faith do not cover themselves with glory. And again, that's not specific to Christianity. It's kind of covered in a few different faiths. But I think it was important to kind of recognize that this was not an assessment on the belief itself. It's how did this movement, that to a large degree was born out of Australia, right? Because I think the other thing is, whenever Hillsong is covered by Americans, they have this lovely way of making it very much about America. And it's not. We, like it or not, we're responsible for this particular thing, right? So I think it's important that there's an Australian perspective on it. And certainly the film does take you to America, and we speak to Americans as well. But I think it's important that it's told from an Australian perspective, and we go, we're kind of responsible for this thing, the good and the bad. Well, and I think it's kind of ours to solve to some degree. I think so. I think there's a range of reasons why I felt like it was important to approach it in that very particular way that we did.
Well, let me ask you this question to wrap it up then, Mark. In narrowing it down to just the Pentecostal arm of Christianity, is that what the experience here is? What do you think Pentecostal Christianity could do better? If there are these other churches that are going to inherit all of the people that may be deciding to do something differently, what should be the difference about the church, about the kingdom going forward?
Well, I'm going to speak in general terms with an acknowledgement that I think some churches already do this. A church community, there was a time in the history of Pentecostal Christianity actually where there was much more governance given to the congregation. And I think at a certain point, this sort of cult of personality that is not, unique to Australian Pentecostalism. I think cult of personality has been an issue for a long time, allowed a really concentrated sense of power in a handful, and that created problems. The liberties were taken, and I think more control and governance by the everyday membership of churches, I think, and transparency and accountability around that is important. I recognize this is happening, by the way. Lots of churches are doing this, but it's clear that there is still some work that needs to be done. I also think I wrote in an article that I worry that lots of Christians won't watch it because they'll instantly view it as an attack. And I think it's important to note that questioning is not by its very nature an attack. Questioning when things hurt people, questioning whether, the way you ask for an offering is coercive, questioning whether this sort of unrelenting positivity around people volunteering their time with, very unhealthy boundaries, that's not ungodly. What would be ungodly is to ask the question and not give answers. And I note that this has improved. Like, you can see, particularly under, what's management's happening in a place like Hillsong, you can see they're talking about it more. But that's, big, shiny in public and on the big stage. I think where it really matters is those small everyday decisions, which are not kind of exposed to the public. And I think a culture of questioning, a culture of asking, is this right? Is this fair? Is this what your God would want for this structure? I think that's good. I think it's good, and I think it should be built into the DNA of faith communities. I know the phrase "it's a journey." It sounds like MasterChef. It's like a food journey. I know that's overused, but all journeys are built out of questions and answers, right? Want something, learn something, arrive at a discovery, more questions, keep moving. Like that's how they operate. And I think that should be something that's encouraged, not discouraged. And the impression I got from talking to lots of people is that is not the case in some faith communities. Again, he's trying not to, paint in too broad a brush here. So I think it's important that questioning, and I think making questioning part of the culture and encouraging it is good.
And I think you're right in saying that we're definitely at a turning point, an inflection point where these conversations are happening more, and where the next sort of generation of churchgoers are saying, hey, yeah, we do want to ask questions. We do want to have that permission to think about things in a way that maybe we haven't up until now. So, Marc, thank you so much for your work in bringing the kingdom to screens, and also in the way that you've approached our conversation today. Really appreciate it.
The pleasure's entirely mine. This was the conversation I was most hoping to have.
And I'm really glad we did get to chat to Marc, because I think his approach to the ongoing stories we're seeing about Hillsong Pentecostalism in Australia, the role of churches in creating healthy communities, it's something a bit different to what you might have seen up until now. You can see The Kingdom from June 8 on SBS On Demand, and it is going to air 7:30 p.m. Sunday, the 11th of June on SBS. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can let me know what you think. Email undistracted@hope1032.com.au. And of course, you can watch this episode on our Hope 1032 YouTube channel as well. Until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.